May 1943. Over 40 U-boat converged on convoy ONS5 in the North Atlantic. The convoy consisted of 43 merchant ships traveling from Liverpool to Halifax. The escorts knew they were outnumbered. 30 submarines against 16 escort vessels. For the U-boat commanders, this should have been a massacre. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. The convoy battle for ONS5 opened on April 28, when U-650 spotted the merchant ships 400 nautical miles south of Greenland. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding U-boat operations from headquarters in Paris, ordered every available submarine to converge on the convoy. He assembled Wolfpack Star and Frink, comprising 43 U-boat total. This was one of the largest concentrations of submarines deployed against a single convoy in the entire war. For 3 years, German U-boat had dominated the Atlantic. They operated on the surface at night, invisible to British radar, faster than most escort ships, able to position themselves ahead of convoys and strike from darkness. In March 1943, U-boat had sunk 82 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic, totaling 476,000 tons. It was the worst month of the war for Allied shipping losses. British officials were discussing whether they could continue the war if the losses continued. Fuel reserves were down to 3 months. Food stockpiles were at emergency levels. The U-boat force had never been stronger. By May 1943, Germany had 240 operational submarines. 118 were at sea. New boats were being commissioned faster than the Allies could sink them. German shipyards were producing 20 U-boat per month. Losses before May averaged fewer than 10 boats per month. The mathematics favored Germany. If they could sink Allied ships faster than they could be replaced, Britain would be forced to surrender. But something had changed in ways the U-boat commanders couldn't understand. In April, 15 submarines had been lost. That was higher than normal, but not catastrophic. Experienced commanders attributed it to improved British escort tactics and increased air patrols. The intelligence staff at U-boat headquarters had no indication that Allied technology had fundamentally changed. Hanke, commanding U-515, had been one of the most successful aces in the Atlantic. Between February 1942 and April 1944, he sank 23 ships totaling over 140,000 tons. On the night of April 30th to May 1st, 1943, Hanke had attacked convoy TS-37 off West Africa. He sank 7 ships in 12 hours using new magnetic influence detonators. It was one of the most successful single convoy attacks of the war. For that patrol, Hanke received the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross. But even during that successful attack, Hanke had noticed something unusual. A British escort destroyer had appeared without any warning from his MTOX radar receiver. The MTOX was supposed to detect British radar at ranges up to 15 kilometers. It had always worked before. This time, the receiver had remained silent until the destroyer was close enough to open fire. Hanke had been forced to crash dive and barely escaped. He reported the incident in his patrol log, noting that Allied radar seemed to be operating on different frequencies than expected. When Hanke returned to base at Laurent, the engineering staff examined his MTOX receiver. They found nothing wrong. The unit was functioning normally. He could detect the 1.5-meter wavelength radar the British had been using for 2 years. The engineers concluded that either the destroyer hadn't been using radar or Hanke's operator had missed the warning signal in the confusion of the attack. The official explanation was operator error during high-stress combat. Other commanders reported similar experiences. Corvetting Pitt Eric Top, one of Germany's top aces with 35 ships sunk, had retired from active patrol duty in September 1942 to command a training flotilla, but he stayed in contact with operational commanders and heard their reports. Aircraft were finding surfaced at night with impossible accuracy. Escorts were appearing without radar warning. Depth charge attacks were becoming more precise even when submarines took evasion maneuvers. The debriefing officers at U-boat headquarters collected these reports. By early May 1943, they had documented 17 separate incidents where commanders reported Allied detection without MTOX warning. The pattern was clear. Something had changed. But German intelligence had no information about any new British radar system. Radio intercepts gave no indication. Captured equipment from downed aircraft showed only the familiar 1.5-meter systems. Agents in Britain reported nothing unusual. The German naval staff faced a problem they couldn't solve with the information they had. Either the MTOX receivers were failing in ways that couldn't be detected during testing, or the British had developed a completely new radar system that German engineers said was technically impossible. The staff chose to believe the receivers were failing. The alternative was too disturbing. It would mean that German radar research was years behind Allied capabilities. It would mean that every tactical assumption about what was possible needed to be reconsidered. What the Germans didn't know was that on March 17, 1943, British Coastal Command had deployed the first operational ASV Mark III radar on a Wellington bomber. The ASV Mark III operated on 10 centimeters wavelength generated by a cavity magnetron. It could detect a surfaced U-bit at 16 kilometers. It could detect a submarine's periscope at 8 kilometers. And the MOX receiver every U-bit carried was completely blind to it. The cavity magnetron had been invented in February 1940 by John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham. It was a breakthrough that solved problems engineers had struggled with for years. Previous vacuum tubes couldn't generate sufficient power at wavelengths shorter than 50 centimeters. The magnetron used resonant cavities machined into a solid copper block to create powerful microwave oscillations. The first prototype generated 400 watts at 10 centimeters wavelength. That was 50 times more powerful than any previous microwave source. By June 1940, General Electric Company had produced sealed cavity magnetrons suitable for aircraft use. These production units could generate peak power of 10 kilowatts in short pulses. That was enough to build radar systems with detection ranges measured in tens of kiloohm. The technology represented a quantum leap in radar capability. The magnetron weighed 400 g. It was a copper cylinder 8 centimeters in diameter and 6 centimeters tall. Inside were 8 resonant cavities arranged around a central cathode. When energized, electrons spiraled around the cathode in a magnetic field. As the electrons passed each cavity opening, they stimulated microwave oscillations that synchronized to produce coherent output at 3000 MHz. The complete ASV Mark III system included the magnetron transmitter, a rotating antenna, a receiver unit, 2 cathode ray tube displays, and power supplies. Total weight was 90 kilograms. It required a dedicated operator watching displays and calling out target contacts. The system was mechanically complex and required constant maintenance. Magnetrons had limited life, typically 40 to 60 hours before requiring replacement. The rotating antenna mechanism jammed in humid conditions. Cath ray tubes failed from vibration. Coastal Command ground crews spent more time repairing ASV Mark III than any other equipment. But when it worked, it transformed anti-submarine warfare. An aircraft with ASV Mark III could patrol at night or in heavy weather and detect surfaced U-bit at ranges where visual detection was impossible. The submarine had no warning until the aircraft was within 1 kilometer. By that time, escape was impossible. A surfaced submarine needed 30 seconds to crash. Dive to safe depth. Aircraft could close 1 kilometer in 15 seconds. The magnetron had originally been developed for H-2S ground mapping radar used by Bomber Command. But in early 1943, Winston Churchill personally ordered that a maritime version be rushed into service. Churchill had been briefed on March losses. 82 merchant ships sunk in a single month. Over 470,000 tons lost. If March loss rates continued, Britain would be forced to negotiate surrender by autumn. Churchill summoned Air Chief Marshal Philip Ubear on March 25. Ubear explained that Coastal Command had been requesting H-2S radar for over a year, but Bomber Command had priority. Churchill overruled Bomber Command. He issued a direct order that 20% of H-2S production would be diverted to Coastal Command immediately. Harris protested. Churchill told him the Battle of the Atlantic took priority. Without Atlantic supply lines, Britain would lose the war before bombers could destroy Germany's industrial capacity. The ASV Mark III entered service in March 1943. The first successful attack came on March 22 when a Wellington from No. 172 Squadron detected U-665 in the Bay of Bisque. The submarine's MTOX gave no warning. The aircraft appeared at 300 meters and dropped 6 depth charges before the crew could react. U-665 survived but was so badly damaged it had to abort and return to base. Over the next 6 weeks, ASV Mark III-equipped aircraft sank 11 U-boat and damaged 23 others. Almost none detected the radar before attack. MTOC's receivers remained silent. U-boat commanders reported that aircraft seemed to be using visual detection because there was no other explanation for finding surface boats at night. German intelligence investigated every attack. They analyzed reports. They questioned survivors. They examined recovered equipment. They found nothing unusual. MTOC's receivers functioned normally. British radar should be operating on frequencies it had used for 2 years. There was no indication of technological change. Then in early May, a rumor started circulating. Several returning commanders reported that captured British aircrew had told interrogators that Coastal Command was homing in on radiation emitted by MTOC's receivers themselves. Super-heterodyne receivers emit weak signals on their intermediate frequency. British aircraft had supposedly developed direction finding equipment sensitive enough to detect those emissions at 90 kilometers. The story sounded plausible. German engineers confirmed that MTOC's receivers did emit detectable signals on their intermediate frequency of 455 kHz. The emissions could be detected at 2 kilometers with specialized equipment. Could the British have developed airborne direction finders sensitive enough to detect them from 90 kilometers? Engineers ran calculations. It would require receiver sensitivity 50D be better than anything currently available. It would require large directional antennas several meters in size. Such equipment would be too heavy and bulky for patrol aircraft. The physics didn't support the claim, but the alternative was less believable. If the British weren't detecting MTOC's emissions, they must have developed completely new radar on frequencies MTOS couldn't receive. That would mean wavelengths shorter than 60 centimeters. German research had concluded years ago that centimetric wavelengths were impractical. Power output was too low. Range was too short. Components were too unreliable. British engineers must have reached the same conclusions. The intelligence staff faced an impossible choice. Accept that the British had achieved a breakthrough German science said was impossible. Or accept that British aircraft were detecting MTOCs through methods German engineers said were impractical. Both seemed equally unlikely. But U-boat were dying and headquarters needed to give commanders guidance on survival. The decision was made to assume the MTOC's emission story was true. Fit known physics. Could be tested. Could be countered by shutting off the receivers. The alternative sentiment radar was too disturbing. If the British really had operational sentiment radar, it meant German radar research was years behind. It meant technology assessments guiding military planning were fundamentally wrong. That was too large a shift to make based on speculation. On August 3, 1943, Admiral Donut issued an emergency order. All U-boat at sea were to shut off MTOC's receivers immediately. Better to operate without radar warning than to broadcast. Position to every British plane within 100 kilometers. What Donut didn't know was that the MTOC's emission story was deliberate disinformation. A captured British pilot had been briefed before every patrol on what to say if captured. British intelligence knew air crew would be interrogated about radar systems. They prepared a cover story specifically designed to protect the ASV Mark III secret. The deception worked perfectly. German intelligence verified that MTOC's emissions were technically detectable. They never suspected the real answer was radar operating on frequency their receivers couldn't detect. The cruel irony was that shutting off MTOS made submarines more vulnerable. The old 1.5-meter ASV Mark I was still used on many British aircraft. MTOCs could detect that system. With receivers shut off, U-boat were blind to both old and new radar. The August order to disable MTOCs increased losses instead of reducing them. By late May 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. Convoy ONS5 had been attacked by over 40 U-boat. 13 merchant ships were sunk, but 6 submarines were destroyed and 7 more damaged so badly they had to abort. That was 15% of the attacking force. In previous battles, Germans typically lost 1 or 2 boats while sinking 15 to 20 merchants. The ratio had reversed. Convoy C-128 in mid-May was worse. 17 U-boat attacked. They sank. No merchant ships. 5 submarines were destroyed. 4 more were damaged. The escorts achieved perfect defense while inflicting devastating losses. It had never happened before in the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Convoy SC-130. At the end of May was the breaking point. Admiral Dennett's son Peter was serving as watch officer on U-954, part of the Wolfpack assigned to attack the convoy. On May 19, U-954 was detected by a British escort frigate and sunk with depth charges. There were no survivors. Peter Dunitz was 21 years old. When news reached Dunnut, he ordered immediate review of all operations. The staff presented statistics. In May alone, 41 U-boat had been lost. That was 25% of operational submarine force. Another 37 boats were damaged. Some would be out of service for months. In exchange, submarines had sunk only 58 Allied merchant ships, 34 in the Atlantic. The mathematics were devastating. German shipyards could eventually replace lost submarines, but they couldn't replace experienced crews. Most commanders killed in May were combat veterans with multiple successful patrols. Their knowledge, instincts, ability to read situations and make split-second decisions couldn't be replaced by fresh academy graduates. The U-boat force was losing its institutional memory, its tactical expertise, its ability to fight effectively. On May 24, 1943, Donitz made the hardest decision of his career. He sent a signal to all U-boat in the Atlantic. Withdraw from convoy routes immediately. Return to base. Suspend all offensive operations until further notice. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. Germany had lost. In his war diary, Dunit wrote, "We are at present facing the greatest crisis in submarine warfare. The enemy has rendered fighting impossible through use of location devices and is causing us heavy losses." He didn't know what those devices were. He didn't know how they worked. He didn't know how to counter them. All he knew was that submarines couldn't operate effectively anymore. Continuing to send them into the Atlantic was throwing away crews and boats for no gain. The withdrawal order marked the end of the U-boat offensive that had nearly starved Britain into submission. For 3.5 years, German submarines had terrorized Atlantic convoy routes. They'd sunk 2,300 Allied merchant ships totaling over 11 million tons. They'd killed 30,000 merchant seamen. They'd come within weeks of cutting Britain's supply lines completely. Churchill himself admitted the UOTE was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. And it had been stopped by a 10 centimeters radar system the Germans didn't know existed. The truth began emerging slowly. On September 4, 1943, 4 months after May withdrawal, Telefon delivered the first NACO's radar warning receivers to U-boat bases. NOS could detect centimetric radar. It operated between 2500 and 3750 MHz, covering the 10 centimeters band British were using. Finally, German submarines had a way to detect ASV Mark III before it could guide aircraft to their position. But it was too late. By September, Allied anti-submarine forces had grown so powerful that even with radar warning, U-boat couldn't operate safely. Very long range. B-24 Liberator bombers had closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort carriers provided continuous air cover over convoys. Hunter-killer groups with latest sonar and radar actively sought submarines instead of just defending merchants. Allied shipyards were launching new vessels faster than U-boat could sink them. NOS revealed what had been killing U-boat for 5 months. Operators reported detecting 10 centimeters radar at ranges up to 8 kilometers. That was enough warning to dive before aircraft could close to attack range. But NASO's was temperamental. It suffered from false alarms. Its sensitivity made it pick up signals from ships and aircraft too far away to be threats, causing unnecessary dives that wasted battery power. Many commanders found it almost as frustrating as having no warning system. Germans tried to adapt. They developed new tactics for operating under constant surveillance. They equipped submarines with more anti-aircraft guns and ordered them to fight on surface instead of diving when attacked. That led to disasters. British aircraft were heavily armed and could destroy submarine guns from outside their effective range. They tried moving operations to different areas. Submarines were sent to the Indian Ocean, South Atlantic, Caribbean, anywhere convoys might be less protected, but Allies had sentiment-rich radar everywhere. ASB Mark III and American equivalents were standard equipment on maritime patrol aircraft worldwide. By late 1943, there was nowhere to hide. American aircraft operating from Brazil and Caribbean used A/APS-2 radar, functionally identical to ASV Mark III. It operated on same 10 centimeters wavelength with similar detection ranges. The technological advantage was global. The fundamental problem was that submarines had lost their primary advantage. For 3 years, U-boat had operated on surface at night, invisible to Allied radar, faster than escort ships, able to position for attacks. That advantage was gone. Centimetric radar could detect surface submarines at night as easily as daylight. U-boat were forced to operate submerged most of patrol, which cut speed from 17 knots to 7, reduced operational range by half, made it nearly impossible to intercept fast convoys. Battery endurance became critical limitation. Type 7C submarine carried 2 banks of 62-cell batteries at maximum submerged speed of 7.6 knots. Batteries exhausted in 90 minutes. At economical speed of 4 knots, endurance extended to 80 hours. But 80 hours submerged meant 80 hours of limited mobility. No ventilation, no battery charging, no opportunity to attack. When batteries exhausted, submarines had to surface and run diesel engines to recharge, taking 4 to 6 hours. During that time, they were vulnerable to radar detection. The cycle became self-reinforcing. Submarines stayed submerged to avoid radar. Staying submerged exhausted batteries. Surfacing to recharge exposed them to radar. Diving to evade aircraft used more battery power. Running submerged to operational areas used battery power that could have been saved for return. Boats were spending more time hiding and less time hunting. Patrol effectiveness dropped by more than half. By end of 1943, U-boat operations had become suicide missions. New submarines were sent into Atlantic with inexperienced crews who had no idea how to fight Allied technological superiority. Loss rates climbed above 50%. Some boats were sunk on first patrol before reaching operational areas. Average lifespan of U-boat in Atlantic had dropped to less than 3 months. For comparison, average lifespan in 1942 had been over a year. Training couldn't compensate. U-boat school at Gutenhofen turned out new crews every month, but they received only 12 weeks training before assignment. 12 weeks to learn navigation, torpedo tactics, damage control, diesel maintenance, radio procedure, and 100 other skills. Experienced crews had refined over years. New crews were technically proficient, but had no combat instincts. They didn't know how to read tactical situations. They didn't know when to attack and when to evade. They didn't know how to survive. Experienced commanders who survived tried to warn new crews, but there was no way to train for what they would face. Old tactics didn't work anymore. Doctrine developed through years of successful operations was obsolete. Headquarters couldn't provide better guidance because they still didn't fully understand what had changed or how to counter it. Vera Hanke survived until April 9, 1944, when U-515 was sunk by American destroyers. An aircraft from USS Guadalcanal. 16 crew members were killed. 44 survived, including Hinke. He was taken prisoner and later killed on June 15, while attempting to escape from an interrogation center at Fort Hunt, Virginia. The ASV Mark III remained classified until after the war. German intelligence never fully understood what happened during Black May. They knew British had developed some form of new radar. They knew it operated on centimetric wavelengths, but they never realized how early it had been deployed or how completely it changed the tactical situation. German records from May 1943 are filled with references to unknown Allied detection methods and mysterious location equipment. British Coastal Command eventually published statistics on ASV Mark III effectiveness. From March through July 1943, aircraft with new radar sank 37 U-boat and seriously damaged 49 others that represented over half of all U-boat losses during that period. Most attacks came without warning. Crews who survived reported that radar detectors gave no indication of approaching aircraft until too late to dive. Germans eventually developed their own sentiment radar. The Berlin series, based on a captured British magnetron, recovered from a downed bomber in February 1943, entered service on Hubit in late 1944. But by then, the Battle of the Atlantic was long over. Submarines it was installed on were mostly used for weather reporting and transportation missions, not convoy attacks. The technology came too late to change anything. Admiral Donitz remained convinced throughout the war that combination of factors defeated his U-boat in May 1943. Better Allied training, improved tactics, more escort ships and aircraft, closing of mid-Atlantic air gap, better sonar and depth charges. He knew Centime radar was part of the answer, but never fully grasped how decisive it had been. He thought it was one element among many. He didn't realize it was the primary factor that rendered his entire tactical doctrine obsolete overnight. The final statistics tell the story. In March 1943, U-boat sank 82 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic. They lost 12 submarines, a ratio of almost 7-1 in Germany's favor. In April, they sank 39 ships and lost 15 boats. Ratio dropped to about 2.5-1. In May, they sank 34 ships and lost 41 submarines. Ratio had reversed. For every merchant sunk, Germans lost more than one submarine. After May, ratio never again favored U-boat. By end of 1943, it took more than 3 submarine patrols to sink single merchant ship. By 1944, it was closer to 5. U-boat force kept fighting until end of war, but never again threatened Allied convoy routes. The offensive capability that had nearly won Battle of Atlantic had been broken in single month by radar system operating on wavelength. German receivers couldn't detect. That's how wars are won. Not through massive battles or brilliant strategies, but through small technological advantages that one side doesn't know the other possesses. SV Mark III wasn't a wonder weapon. It was modest improvement over existing radar technology made possible by new type of vacuum tube that could generate shorter wavelengths, but deployed at the right moment against enemy who didn't know it existed. That modest improvement changed course of war. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories